The stark facts of global greed, a disease as challenging as climate change, is the headline on Paul Buchheit's piece over on Alternet today. There is an extraordinary price that Americans and, frankly, people all over the world are paying for 34 years of Thatchernomics and Reaganomics that has not been limited to the United States and the UK, but has spread like a virus around the world. And it includes this bizarre notion as, well, what was the actor's name who played Michael Douglas? Yeah, as Michael Douglas said in Wall Street, it comes from this notion. Check this out.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
Right. And that, defined the 80s and defined the transformation of America with the Reagan presidency, where we went from Jimmy Carter walking to his inaugural balls, walking back from the Capitol building to the White House, and inviting average people to his inaugural balls and not charging for them, to Ronald Reagan charging $1,000 to $10,000 a head, and people wearing, super spiffy, very elegant, very expensive clothes, and making them basically just for big donors and famous people. So, the question in my mind is, what is greed costing America? Let's just go through the list here. At least some of the things that are, I think, the low-hanging fruit, the obvious stuff on my list. Greed has cost us millions of people being incarcerated when they shouldn't have been. Their lives are destroyed. Their future earnings are wiped out. Their ability to vote in many states is no longer even exists. They can't participate. There's this block the box movement to make it against the law for employers to ask if you've ever been convicted of a felony. Have you ever been in jail? It's not going to succeed, or probably not going to succeed. But the reality is that they never should have been in jail in the first place. We have more people in prison than any other country in the world, both on an actual number and per capita basis. Why? Because of greed. Because people are making money off people going to prison. We have a for-profit private prison industry. We have a for-profit industry, quote, fighting the drug war. These companies making drug testing kits and every other kind of thing. Running rehab clinics and everything. Enforced rehab is the new soft incarceration. Why? But why do they do it? Why is it written into our laws? Why are judges do it? Because you can make a buck off it. Our public schools are being eviscerated. They're being destroyed. Why? Because you can make a buck off charter schools. And so you've got these private for-profit charter schools opening up, and they cherry-pick the best students, and they dump the poorer students on the public schools. And then, what kind of predictable result comes out of that? Our healthcare crisis in the United States. There's and the fact that, it costs a fortune and still you can go bankrupt if you get sick. There's an amazing piece Liz Alderman and Stephen Greenhouse wrote for the international business section of the New York Times. It comes with a couple of different headlines. One of them is serving up fries for a living wage. And they tell the story. They open this piece with the story of Hampus Ellefson. It's a fellow who lives in Denmark. And he works 40 hours a week at Burger King. And they open the story with his having paid his rent, paid all his bills, put some money in savings, and now he's preparing to go out with his friends and have a movie and a beer. How can he afford to pay all his bills and still have a leisure life that costs a little bit of money? Because in Denmark, nobody makes less than $20 an hour working in fast food. Nobody. There is no minimum wage in Denmark, but there are very large, very powerful unions. $20 an hour. Now, here's where it gets really amazing. American fast food workers, by the way, earn an average of $8.90 an hour, according to the article. And they quote this guy, Mr. Moore, Anthony Moore, down in Tampa, Florida, who is working at Burger King in the United States and can't pay his rent, can't buy food, can't pay his medical bills. Well, in Denmark, you never have to worry about your medical bills. Everything is paid for. It's free. But Mr. Moore here in Tampa can't even afford Burger King's insurance copays and coverage. By the way, in Denmark, fast food workers get 5 weeks paid vacation, paid maternity and paternity. They have a pension plan. They're paid overtime for working after 6 p.m. and working on Sundays. They get their schedules 4 weeks in advance. And employers can't send them home early, the article says, without pay just because business slows. What about turnover? Well, 70% of their employees are there for more than a year. Turnover of fast food joints in the United States, 20-30% after a year are still there. The average length of working at a fast food joint in the United States is 8 months. By the way, you would say, oh, well, if the employees are making more than twice as much, the burgers must cost a lot more. A Big Mac in Denmark costs $5.60 compared to $4.80 in the United States. 80 cents more. Not so much. And in fact, HMS Host Denmark is a company, sort of like, in the United States, you got these companies that operate restaurant concessions in airports and things. This is the biggest one in Denmark. They run the one in the Copenhagen airport, for example. And the guy who is the general manager, now this is the guy who's running restaurants. The guy who's the general manager of HMS Host, he says, and I quote from the New York Times piece, serving up fries for a living wage. He says, quote, the article says, he noted proudly that a full-time Burger King employee made enough to live on. Quote, the company doesn't get as much profit, but the profit is shared a little differently. We don't want there to be a big difference between the richest and the poorest because poor people would just get really poor, Mr. Drescher added. We don't want people living in the streets. If that happens, we consider that we as a society have failed. The guy working at the Burger King in the United States, by the way, he says he even goes to work when he's sick because he can't afford to lose his job. In Denmark, paid sick time. In just the last 3 years, back to Paul Buchheit's piece in Alternate, in just the last 3 years, the bottom half of Americans, the bottom 50% of Americans, who 3 years ago had 2.5% of our nation's wealth, now it's down to 1.3%. The bottom half of Americans' workers have lost half of their wealth in 3 years. And the top half, if you look at everything except the top 1%, they lost 2. He says the 36 million upper middle class households just above the median 6th, 7th, 8th deciles dropped from a 13.4% share to an 11.9% of the share. Much of their portion went to the richest 1% too. Total U.S. wealth, $84 trillion. Over $1 trillion moved from the bottom half of America to the richest 1%, and another $1 trillion from the upper middle class to the top 1%. The billionaires are sucking us dry. Graham Nash was on Morning Joe this morning. I'll play that for you after the break. But he had some things to say about our billionaires, our landed gentry, our oligarchs, specifically the Koch brothers. But the question, what is greed costing the United States? It's costing us our health, in our food systems and in our medical systems. It's costing us our wealth. It's costing us our happiness as the middle class is disintegrated. Suicide rates are going up, particularly among working class men.